pre-scientific or pre-philosophic thought. Whereas in modern times these concepts are inherited and they are ready for use, used therefore, and which is more important, transformed, but no longer originally required. Which implies that if we wish to understand the modern concepts which came into being through the transformation of those concepts inherited from classical antiquity, that we have to return first to the classical basis if we wish to understand the modern concepts. Classical political philosophy, we can also say, is related to political life directly, not through a non-political medium as a tradition of political philosophy or as a non-political political science as in our age. And the simple sign of that is that in classical political philosophy there are no technical terms to speak of. The terms are terms used in ordinary political life, in the marketplace, in senates, in cabinets, but not peculiarly scientific or academic terms, whereas the opposite is true in modern times and already to some extent in the Middle Ages. The classical political philosophers try to understand political life as a citizen and the statesman understand it, with this difference that they try to look further ahead or afield than the practical men do, but not in a different perspective. They are not standing, as it were, outside and observing political life, the big fishes swallowing the small ones, but in this perspective in which they are seen in political life. One can also say that the method of classical political philosophy is presented by political life itself. In all political life we find conflicts between individuals and groups, the conflicting parties asserting opposed claims, ordinarily in the name of justice. Now both sides use arguments in support of their claims. Not all these arguments are solid, but they supply nevertheless the starting point for any proper understanding of what supports the claim of the opposed parties. The method is therefore to follow up and consider critically the arguments presented on both sides, and on this basis reach an impartial decision. Because this is the primary form in which the political philosopher appears as the arbiter, the impartial arbiter between the groups opposing opposed claims. An arbiter who will give each side its due. So the political philosopher is then primarily the umpire par excellence. The underlying thought being he's a good citizen, and the duty of the good citizen is to make civil strife cease and to create by persuasion agreement among the citizens. He must not be a partisan. Now, in order to understand more fully the phenomenon of the political philosopher in its original form, we have to consider the fact that as the umpire, the political philosopher is a citizen like every other citizen. He belongs to this or that city, as a rule by birth, son of a citizen father and citizen mother. As such, he cannot fulfill his function in his city other than his own. His work is not transferable from his city to any other city. Yet one observes soon that there are, while this work as such seems to be non-transferable there are necessarily in political life some skills which are, for example, a general may be lent to an allied city in ancient times as well as in ours. Or someone may be banished from his city, like Themistocles was from Athens, and he may prove to be an excellent advisor to the enemy of Athens, the king of Persia. Or later on Alcibiades, who also had to flee from Athens, and yet was the best advisor whom the Spartans could find, since he knew the weaknesses of Athens better than anyone else. He could become an excellent traitor to his fatherland. So there are skills which are transferable. And to the extent to which they are transferable, they are also teachable, in principle like any other art. The teaching of the political arts developed first as that of one important part of the political art, which is the art of speaking. All political action, if it is reasonable, is based on deliberation. The deliberation takes place by means of speech. In a democracy, surely by means of public speech. And the art of public speech was proved to be susceptible of being taught by teachers of the art of rhetoric. And prior to classical political philosophy, we can say political science as a transferable thing had emerged as the art of rhetoric. And at the end of his Ethics, Aristotle takes issue with those people who say the political art is simply the art of rhetoric, and a view which, according to Aristotle, is very erroneous. But at any rate, this was a fact, and this is truly not an accident. That's a part of the political skill which was originally raised to the level of a teachable art was the art of rhetoric. Now, this is proved is insufficient according to from the classical point of view. Deliberation deals in the first place with measures, as we would say war and peace and so on things, but also with things of a more permanent character. War or peace now is the question of the moment. And these permanent things are the laws. Therefore, the more important, the broader thing, object of deliberation, is legislation. And the political science, in the original sense of the term, where it is identical with the political skill, the skill of the statesman, was raised to the level of a transferable teaching when it could become the teaching of the art of legislation. The highest political art, as Aristotle says, is the architectonic art, related to all other arts as the art of the architect to that of the carpenter and other artisans connected with building houses. The net result, the political philosopher comes then to cite not simply as a legislator, but as a teacher of legislators. Every legislator has to do with a particular situation of this city. It's located here and there with these and these enemies, these and these resources and so on. And he tries to do the best for that city. But he cannot do this without having implicitly notions of what is simply good for the city as such. Notions which he adapts to this particular city in not necessarily being aware of the universal principles of preference implied in what he is doing here and now. The teacher of legislators is the teacher of men who are supposed to give laws or to elaborate codes for the most different cities, cannot possibly be bound by the requirements of this or that situation, of this or that city. He must think primarily in universal terms. Now these are then the two figures, we can say, in which the political philosopher primarily appeared in Greece, the umpire par excellence and the teacher of legislators. There is a connection between these two things. The umpire has to do with the settlement of controversies. Now, the fundamental political controversy concerns, as we may provisionally say, the form of government. Should it be a democracy, oligarchy, and so on? This is a fundamental controversy. And the settlement of this controversy precedes legislation proper. For all laws are to be made with a view to the form of government. Inheritance, publicity of speech, whatever you have depends on the form of government. Therefore, by being the legislator, teacher of legislators, the political philosopher is the umpire par excellence. Now, these two considerations, of which I reminded you, the distinction between physis and nomos, and what is implied in Hegel's remark about the difference of study in ancient and modern times, these two general considerations indicate the minimum conditions with which one must comply in order to have an access to classical political philosophy. But this is only a minimum condition. In order to understand classical political philosophy, or in order to study it properly, we have to wonder where we should begin our study of classical political philosophy. My answer would be with Aristotle's Politics, not with Plato. For the writings of Plato, the Republic especially, but the others too, are dialogues, not as Aristotle's Politics is a treatise. In the dialogues, Plato never speaks. One could say, well, while Plato never speaks, Socrates speaks, and Socrates is Plato's mouthpiece. Yet this is not so simple as is sufficiently indicated by the fact that Socrates was most famous for his irony, never to speak oneself, and to have a spokesman who is famous for his irony. This is almost the same as if one were never to speak. More specifically, irony, the word has undergone many changes in the course of the centuries, but in the primary meaning, it means, or secondary meaning, which for us is most important, it means to speak with a view to somebody, ad hominem, as the Latins say. So all remarks which say Socrates makes, or any other Platonic spokesman, are made with a view to the interlocutors, their situation, permanent or momentary, their characters, their abilities, their social position. And in order to find out what Socrates would say about the same subject, absolutely, not with a view to this or that kind of man, one would have to translate the explicit statement into one which would be meant to be absolutely true. One would have to transform the relative statements into absolute statements. And this is not so easy to do, whereas in Aristotle we hear Aristotle himself talking to us all the time. This difference between Aristotle and Plato is also the reason why it is not wise to begin one's study of classical political thought with the dramatic poets, who of course speak as little by themselves as Plato does. And it would be a great mistake to believe that the choruses present directly the view, say, of Socrates. Even in the case of the historian Thucydides, the most important broad statements are not made by Thucydides himself, but by his characters in his speeches. And then again the question arises, what did Thucydides think of the wisdom and understanding of the particular speaker? So it is most prudent to begin the study of classical political thought with Aristotle. As for the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, we have only fragments of them. And to interpret fragments, to understand them properly, is infinitely more difficult than to understand complete books. Now, as for how to study Aristotle's politics in a very external way, meaning which translation to use, I would think that the best translation available is that by Ernest Barker in the Oxford edition, which is also available, I believe, in the paperback. Ernest Barker. The translation is useful especially for this reason, that Barker gives in brackets explanation of the very terse statements which Aristotle makes, and which to begin with would be wholly unintelligible. It is true that this effect that Aristotle becomes much more loquacious or talkative than he in fact is, and the peculiar charm and characteristic of Aristotle is lost in that way. But you cannot have it both ways, and to begin with one must be grateful for every help one can get. Barker has also written in this book a very useful introduction, in which he takes up an issue which is quite confusing and quite useless, namely the question of the development, the so-called development of Aristotle's thought from his early time when he was sitting at Plato's feet until his old age, something which some philologists believe they could find out about, and Barker very wisely reaches the conclusion that it's impossible to say anything about that. But since you may be confronted with this issue of the development of Aristotle, it's quite good to read Barker's sober argument. Now let us then turn without any further ado to the beginning of Aristotle's politics. And we will read at the beginning. We begin at the beginning. Do you have it? Does anyone of you have the edition? Well, I read it. Observation shows us first that every polis or state is a species of association. And secondly, that all associations are instituted for the purpose of attaining some good. For all men do all their acts with a view to achieving something which is, in their view, a good. We may therefore hold that all associations aim at some good, and we may also hold that the particular association, which is the most sovereign of all, the most authoritative of all, and includes all the others, will pursue this aim to the highest degree, and will thus be directed to the most sovereign, the most authoritative of all goods. This most authoritative and inclusive association is a polis, as it is called, or the political association. Now Aristotle goes, as you see, immediately into the midst of things. The politics naturally deals with the polis. Now the first question which arises, to which we have alluded before, is how to translate polis. Barker follows the usual procedure by saying the polis, or the state. But we have been reminded by Collingwood, some passages which I read to you, as this is a grave question whether one can translate in this manner. Some people say that today, in order to avoid the difficulty, the city-state, which doesn't make it better, because then we imply, of course, already that we know what the state is, and think there is a kind of state called the city-state, and belief to solve the question this way. Now let us look at a later political thinker and his definition of what Aristotle means roughly by the polis, and that is Thomas Hobbes. Let us see how he defines the polis. This none, I will not read what that is, the multitude so united in one person, is called a commonwealth. In Latin, civitas. But civitas was a traditional translation into Latin of the Greek polis. So, commonwealth would be a tolerably good translation of polis. Let us also see another translation of the term by Hobbes, which is somewhat closer to our concern. In the Elements of Law, Part 1, Chapter 19, this union so made is that which men call nowadays, he doesn't say a state, a body politic, or civil society. And the Greeks call it polis, that is to say, a city. So you see, even in the 17th century, the word state was not yet necessary, was not the most natural one for a man like Hobbes to use. Hobbes translates polis by city, which is the best translation of the word as well, and he gives the equivalent in English of a body politic or civil society. Now we shall then not hesitate to translate polis by city. But we must be clear that this is only replacing one riddle by another. You know, the riddle being the Greek word polis, and then we replace it by the riddle in English called the city. So when we speak of city, we surely do not mean the polis. Think of the city of London, or the city in London, which has entirely different connotation. We have therefore to raise the question, what is the equivalent of polis in our world, in our language? Surely not the state. For when we speak of the state, we imply a distinction between the state and society. And the very beginning of the politics, which I read to you, shows that this is excluded. The state, if we speak of state and society, we do not say the state is an all-inclusive society and society is only a partial society. The simple and best equivalent in English to what the Greeks meant by the polis is the country. When you speak of the country is in danger, so you also don't make a distinction between state and society. You mean a single whole. The polis consists of a town and countryside, but so does the country, which consists of towns, cities, and countrysides. This is a country, we may say, is the equivalent of polis on the level of our everyday citizens' understanding. But this is not sufficient, because we are not simply thinking on that everyday level. I wonder whether the term the country is ever used in a scientific treatise within political science or sociology, although it will occur frequently in political speeches. This shows you the cleavage between pre-scientific understanding and scientific understanding, which is so characteristic of our age. Now, the passage which I read to you at the very beginning of the politics shows that the polis is concerned with the most comprehensive good, whereas the other associations, the associations subordinate to the city, are concerned with subordinate, partial good. Now, the term which Aristotle uses for this comprehensive good is in Greek oidaimonia, ordinarily translated into English by happiness. Let us not go into this great question of how to translate oidaimonia, and let us simply use the word happiness for the time being. The complete human good. Now the polis is concerned with the complete human good. Now, by happiness, Aristotle understands above all virtuous activity. And of course this means that you dispose of the conditions of virtuous activity. So if you are very sick, for example, you are not, and for this reason not able to act virtuously in every respect, as this shows indirectly that health is a part of happiness. But happiness, of course, different people have different views of happiness, and even the same people at different times of their lives. So one can assume, as when we are more inclined to assume in modern times than in ancient times, that happiness is strictly subjective. And then, of course, it becomes impossible to define the end of the state in terms of happiness. Political society cannot be defined then as a society devoted to happiness. This is perhaps the best starting point for understanding the peculiar obstacle which we have in understanding polis. Yet when we look around and admit that there is an innumerable variety of notions of what happiness is, we can nevertheless hold that there is something in common despite this enormous variety, and that is certain conditions of happiness. Whatever you may understand by happiness, you need to be alive in order to pursue your happiness. Furthermore, you must have the possibility of circulation. You must be free. If you are chained or jailed, you are not likely to pursue your happiness, whatever you may understand by happiness. And thirdly, you must have the possibility of pursuing happiness as you understand happiness. I refer to a formula known to you all from the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here it is understood, they are understood here in the Declaration as man's fundamental natural rights. But one can also look at them from the other point of view, in no way contradicting, that they are the conditions for happiness, however happiness may be understood. Now, here we have then this strange situation. Men are striving for happiness. For life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are only in the service of the enjoyment of happiness. Happiness is the end. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are means, and therefore lower. But on the other hand, whereas happiness is wholly subjective, everyone understands something different by happiness, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are objective. Whatever you understand by happiness, you need life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, men pursue happiness as he understands happiness. And this takes place partly in cooperation with others and partly in competition with others. This cooperative, competitive activity, where each aims at his happiness, produces a kind of web, we can say. And this web is society, in contradistinction to the state. The state only is concerned with the conditions as specified before. Now, in this understanding of the relation of state and society, there is a peculiar ambiguity. In one respect, the state is higher. It aims at something which all need, something of objective validity. But these are all only means, and therefore lower. The highest is no longer objective. In order to overcome this difficulty, this dualism where the order of rank between the two elements, state and society, is ambiguous, one must turn to something broader, of which state and society as hitherto understood are parts, and modern man succeeded in discovering such a thing or in inventing it. And that is this matrix of which state and society and some other things are parts is exactly what is ordinarily understood by culture. When you speak of the culture of a tribe or a nation or a city, it means this broader thing, this broader association of which state and society is part. I would say that the concept of culture, now so widely used, is the equivalent of polis on the level of theory, on the level of academic thought as distinguished from citizen thought, on which former level the equivalent of polis is a country. We would say, for example, that tragedy, dramatic poetry, belongs to culture, but not to the state. Yet according to the classics, tragedy has a certain moral function, say the purification of some certain passions. And the moral function is inseparable from the political function. Therefore, tragedy belongs to the polis, as it in fact did in Athens. Surely, tragedy is not exhausted by that moral political function, but to the extent to which it transcends it, it belongs to the sphere of wisdom which is no longer a part of the polis. So in other words, what we would call culture is, from the classical point of view, a composite consisting of the polis on the one hand and of wisdom on the other. And we learn from this, incidentally, that our concept of culture presupposes a much closer connection between polis and wisdom than the classics did. That, so to speak, every polis has its peculiar wisdom, a thought which the classics implicitly rejected. Wisdom proper is universal, de jure, whether de facto is another question. Now, by making this reflection, which could be enlarged on the modern equivalence of polis, we do justice to the truth of historicism, namely to the fact that radical changes have in fact occurred, so that the understanding of the most important and fundamental terms has changed. Now, is there any point which you would think needs some further clarification, or where you feel it could now be given? The last point is perhaps most difficult to understand. The last point which I made, that polis and wisdom are not only distinguishable, but have a fundamentally different character insofar as a polis is always this or that polis, particular society, whereas wisdom is universal, de jure, as I said, if not necessarily de facto. Whereas our modern concept of culture implies an assimilation of these two things. Yes?
But doesn't the fact that the Greeks regarded tragedy as having a moral function which in turn was inseparable from the political function imply that they regarded wisdom, at least in the form of poetry, as being more subordinate to political?
Yeah, well, the word wisdom has many meanings. there is a practical wisdom which essentially belongs to practical political life. I meant now wisdom in a severer and stricter sense, where it is theoretical wisdom, say the understanding of man in tragedy, for example.
Yeah, well, the fact that tragedy usually has some theoretical wisdom about man, and yet you say that the tragedy, the moral function of tragedy in Greece was inseparable from its political function.
Yeah, that is inseparable.
Not that art is supposed to have either a moral or a political function. When it does have a moral function, it's still inseparable.
No, the moral function belongs together with the political function. It is the purpose of the city to make the citizens good and doers of noble deeds, as Aristotle says. That is inseparable. And Aristotle calls the whole teaching, which includes his ethics, a kind of political investigation. That is not the point. There is no, the difficulty doesn't lie there. Well, let me start from another phenomenon which I have to touch upon later, without which one cannot understand this whole of classicalism. Our present-day thought, and already since some centuries, is based on a fundamentally different understanding of the relation between theoretical wisdom and ordinary human life than the classics had, and especially Aristotle had. And the change was affected by that great movement popularly called the Enlightenment, but which is much more than the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which comprises already the 17th century. If, according to the Enlightenment, wisdom can be spread, can be diffused among the whole population, and therefore the difference between the theoretically wise and the theoretically non-wise ceases to be very important. Does this thing make sense to you? From the very notion of an enlightenment of this kind is absent from classical thought, and therefore there is no simple harmony between philosophy and the polis, between wisdom and the polis. And the wisdom is, according to its own intention, universal. The polis is necessarily particular. You see, what we have done in modern times is also shown by the following fact. The word culture, which means only cultivation in itself, or say of the soil, but of course meant then also the cultivation of the mind, was always used in former times in the singular, cultura mentis. But then in the 19th century, people began to use the term culture in the plural, cultures. That's to say, cultures were now understood to be particular in the same way, or almost the same way, in which political societies are particular. You see? Whereas according to the older notion, there is only one culture of the mind or of the heart. This assimilation of the culture of the mind to political life is a modern phenomenon and underlying our present use of the term culture. That we today, in the ordinary meaning, even in anthropology, culture has nothing whatever to do with any cultivation of the mind. But when you speak of the culture of the juvenile delinquents of a certain district, you do not mean, do not think seriously of any cultivation of the mind. But that is a still further step. But still, it was in a way, because originally in the 19th century, culture, even if used in the plural, meant high culture. Then it was applied to every, quote, culture of every tribe. And then finally, of course, also to every subdivision of any society, however small and deplorable. Now, let us follow Aristotle's argument. Aristotle goes on to prove that the polis is the highest and the most comprehensive association. And he tries to prove that by considering the most important among the other associations. These are the family or the household and the village. And this leads to, at this point we take up his discussion. 1253, A27. Man when perfected is the best of animals. But if he be isolated from law and justice, he is the worst of all. Injustice is all the graver when it is armed injustice. And man is furnished by nature with arms which are intended to serve the purposes of prudence and virtue, but which may be used in preference for opposite ends. That is why, if man be without virtue, he is the most unholy and savage being, and worse than all others in the indulgence of lust and gluttony. Justice belongs to the polis, for justice, which is the determination of what is just, is an ordering of the political association. Now, what does he mean here? What has he in mind? Let us first take another consideration. The polis comes into being out of natural associations, such as a household, and it comes into being out of natural associations. Therefore, it is itself natural. In a sense, it is even more natural than the preceding associations. That is here Aristotle himself. I hope I find this without difficulty. When I do not find my way in Barber's translation, all right, I will try to reconstruct it here. In a sense, I said the city, according to Aristotle, is even more natural than the household and other preceding association. Why? Because all the other associations are in a way imperfect. They do not fulfill all of man's natural needs. Being imperfect, they point to the city as its perfection. The end of a natural thing is most emphatically the nature of a thing. A simple example, if we want to know the nature of a horse, we look at a grown-up horse in a good state of health, etc., meaning that a cold or a sick horse is a defective horse. The nature of the thing is the thing in its perfection. The point with which Aristotle is here concerned is not only that the polis is natural, but above all that it is natural as city, namely as essentially different from the household. Some other thinkers to whom Aristotle alludes, the most important of whom is Plato, had asserted there is only a quantitative difference between the household and the city. Aristotle says no, there is a qualitative, an essential difference, and that is to say, in other words, the polis is natural, precisely in its character as polis, and not merely as an overgrown household. The key implication of that is that if the polis is by nature, the thesis in which, in a way, the whole book begins, is that the polis is not by convention, is not by contract, to use the later term used later on very frequently. Since This being the case, that the polis is by nature, and it follows that man is by nature and the political animal, by nature. And why? Because what is the peculiarity of man? The thing characteristic of man, the specific difference of man. The fact that man possesses logos, speech or reason. And speech or reason is the reason why man is political. Aristotle says man is more political, more social than all other social animals. Logos, speech or reason, socializes much more than anything else could. For without the logos, there would be only a sensual awareness, in particular awareness of pleasure and pain. And this does not bind men together to the same degree as other kinds of awareness. Through logos we have awareness also of just and unjust. We can go a step further and say that the perfect union of two human individuals, of two individuals in general, is possible only in and through thought. If they think identically the same, such an identity regarding feelings can never be known. And even if they use the same words, but if you take the simplest case of if they follow the same demonstration of the same theory, there can be no doubt that their thoughts are fully united. They think exactly the same. The polis is natural to man also in other sense. As Aristotle explains later on in Book 7, more fully, the city is from what we would call a fairly small society. A society in which everyone knows not everybody else. It would be a village. But in which everyone can know an acquaintance of everybody else. So that he can find out about that man, for example, if he's running for office, by a direct knowledge. Also, the polis, as Aristotle understands it, is a society large enough to fulfill all men's essential natural needs, and small enough so that it is commensurate with the limitations of man's natural powers of knowing and of caring. I mean, we can know, in a way we all know President Johnson, Vice President Humphrey, but in which way? From the TV. That is not knowledge, in the sense in which you know someone with whom you have grown up or who has grown up with your parents, and so on. In another way, one could say a polis is a society small enough so that it can be addressed without the help of any artificial things by a speaker. They can be assembled in body and addressed by them. In the passage which I read to you, Aristotle makes it clear that man, to the extent to which he is not political, to which he is pre-political or apolitical, not by accident, but incapable of living with others, is very bad. What Aristotle speaks here about reminds of what Hobbes said of the state of nature. And what Hobbes expresses by saying man is by nature, i.e. without social discipline, without being subject to laws, is asocial. But what is the precise difference between Hobbes and Aristotle? that is of some importance. Now, why is man such a nasty being, according to Hobbes? What makes him so nasty? What Hobbes calls pride, concern with being superior to others and with being recognized as superior by others. This is the reason why Hobbes regards him as asocial. Now Aristotle would reply, but this what you say proves man's asociality, proves man's sociality. A being who is radically dependent on the opinions of others is a radically social being. In other words, Hobbes has not thought deeply enough. He mistakes anti-sociality for asociality. But these anti-social people, you see and hear a lot these days, and they are, of course, in a very radical sense social. They are so much concerned with being important, as they call it. And since they cannot become important by legal ways, they try to get it by illegal ways. But important means, of course, being looked up to by others, a radical sociality. Hobbes mistakes sociality for benevolence, but malevolence also is social, also antisocial. An radically asocial being would not be, in this sense, malevolent. Now, the Aristotelian doctrine that man is by nature social became the traditional doctrine throughout the ages until it was attacked, especially by Hobbes, in the 17th century. And in the 17th, 18th century, there was a running controversy between those who said that man is by nature social and those who denied it. The doctrines asserting man's natural sociality were at that time called the socialist doctrines, and the other the anti-socialist. You see how much the meaning of this term has changed. And by the way, what is true of socialism applies, of course, in a way still more to individualism. For example, the Stoics are famous for their individualism, but in this sense they are, of course, socialists, because they too teach the natural sociality of man. It's only possible. Now, when Aristotle says that the polis is by nature, he means more than the polis is not a convention. He excludes also the view that another kind of political association is by nature, at least to the same degree as the polis, and that is the ethnos in Greek. We can translate it by tribe or nation, a non-urban association of nomads or pillars of the soil or whatever have you. One can state explain the exclusion of the ethnos in the following way. Man is born for civilization. Civilization is derivative from civis, citizen, and civitas, and therefore there is also a Greek equivalent for that, pointing to polis. Man is born for civilization, and in a tribal life he cannot find that. The sentence, the proposition that the polis is natural, means furthermore that the city is not sacred. When Homer and other poets speak of the city, say of Troy, so they call it the sacred city. Aristotle calls it natural. This is also an important consideration. It is confirmed by the fact that in Aristotle's discussion of the virtues in the ethics, piety does not occur. Aristotle emphasizes in the Politics that the concern with divine things is a part of the concerns of the city, temples, sacrifice, and so on, But he indicates the ambiguous position of this concern by the following remark. In enumerating what the concerns of the city are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, he says, at the fifth and at the first place, the concern with the divine things. In other words, from one point of view, it is of course the most important, first place. But from another point of view, it is not. This is a hint which needs thinking through. The concern with the divine things is a part of the concerns of the city, but also it transcends the city, namely in the form of philosophy, which from Aristotle's point of view is of course the highest form of the concern with the divine things. This same view is, by the way, also confirmed by the Republic. The venerable old man Cephalos, the father at the beginning, goes out to sacrifice, whereas Socrates discusses the best political order with a younger man. And one would find other ones. Surely this peculiar secularism must not be identified with a modern secularism for the simple reason because Aristotle was not a man of the Enlightenment. But the situation is clearly enough indicated at the beginning of Plato's dialogue Timaeus, where a man, an interlocutor, has been reminded by Plato's Republic of the old Egyptian order, in which the place occupied in Plato's Republic by the philosophers is occupied by priests, and he is not aware of the difference. But Socrates or Plato were there. It is definitely not a priestly order, the polis, although it necessarily includes priests. Now, the bulk of the first book of the Politics is devoted to the household as the most important part of the city, or to the management of the household. Management of the household is in Greek oikonomia, from which the English word economics is derived. In a way, Aristotle takes up the economic questions, but all within the context of the management of the household. The question of finance and any public economy is not taken up in any way. Except that he defended slavery. Now, that is true, he defended slavery. I shall speak of that immediately. But it is not sufficient to know only this fact, because then one doesn't know why he defended it and what are the limitations of the conscious limitations of his defense. Aristotle starts from the fact that slavery is a controversial thing. And some people say to rule as a master or a slave is against nature. For it is merely by nomos that one man is a slave and the other a free man, and by nature there is no difference. And since it is not based on nature, it is unjust. It is merely an act of violence. Nature is violated by that institution. Aristotle states the problem in these very simple terms. Is slavery natural or convention? If it is only convention, it is, as matter stands, unjust. In order to answer this question, we must of course first define what is a slave. The answer is possession, a piece of property which is animate, not like a pot or a hammer, but more specifically an animate tool, not for the purpose of production of things, but for the purpose of life or use or action. Life is action, not production. Action or use, not production. Production is only in the service of life, but not life itself. In other words, a slave is not understood here as an instrument, as a tool of producing things in mines underground or in factory-like undertakings, but as a household slave, as a helper for man in his life. In order to show, Aristotle asserts that slavery, properly understood, is natural. In order to show that, he starts from the fact that the whole of nature has a hierarchic character. Everywhere we find higher and lower, something which by nature rules and something which by nature is ruled. The example nearest home is the difference between the mind, the soul, and the body. The desire, passions, they belong to the soul in contradistinction to the mind. And the mind is by nature the ruler of the desires and the passions. And the soul in its turn is the ruler of the body. Also, the difference between the male and female, which is not limited to the human race, is also a sign of the hierarchical character of the whole, the male being the ruling part. The soul rules the body, Aristotle says, like a master does, i.e., as if the body were a slave, namely by sheer command, not by persuasion. We cannot talk to our body as we can talk to our anger, for example. And therefore the mind rules the soul, the passions, politically by persuasion. Now the slave participates in speech sufficiently as to be able to listen to speech, but not to have logos within himself. This is Aristotle's definition. And such a man is therefore justly enslaved, and no violence is done to him. On the contrary, for him it is useful to be a slave, just as it is useful to his master to have him as a slave. Now what then is a natural slave? A man who can understand in a way in which no animal can understand, no brute animal can understand, and yet not sufficiently that he can guide his own life. He needs someone else to guide him. So take an example of someone who can understand the command, bring 5 logs into the house. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, and can do that. No dog could do that. But on the other hand, he couldn't take care of himself because he might be wholly incapable of controlling his desire for alcoholic beverages and for other things. The greatest presentation of what Aristotle understands by a natural slave, now from the less amiable side, is the presentation of Caliban in Shakespeare's Tempest, where, if you remember the Caliban, the situation, the thought that Caliban deserves to be controlled by Prospero, and at Prospero's command to be pricked by Ariel and so on, is not a shocking suggestion. The question is, how great can the political relevance of this fact be? Aristotle thought it is very great. So slavery is therefore then natural if applied to people who are by nature slaves. If it is applied to people who are not by nature slaves, it is plainly injustice. So, for example, to enslave people merely because they have been taken prisoners of war, and this is unjust. Now, we will see later on that this is not the last word of Aristotle on this subject. Later on in books 7 to 8, when he describes the best commonwealth, as you see it, he proposes there, slavery is taken for granted, and he proposes there that the slaves be given the prospect of emancipation. Now, this would be clearly impossible in the case of natural slaves, because they are by definition people who cannot be emancipated because they cannot take care of themselves. Therefore, Aristotle must there assume that you will have also slaves who are slaves only by convention, i.e. who are unjustly slaves. How this can be reconciled with what we read in Book 1, we must postpone. Now, Aristotle continues the discussion as follows. It is clear from this explanation of what a slave is that the rule of a master and political rule are not the same, as Plato, among others, seem to have asserted. For the one, political rule is ruled about freemen, the other over freemen, the other over slaves. And the rule within the household is monarchical. For every household is ruled by one man, while political rule is a rule over free and equals. The ruler is not called ruler with a view to the knowledge which he possesses. As you say, a man is a physician with a view to the fact that he possesses the ability, skill, and knowledge as a physician, but because he is such a one, meaning because he is a master. And the same applies also to freemen and slaves. They are not freemen or slaves because of peculiar knowledge which they possess. In this, Aristotle goes on to say that this doesn't mean that there is not a certain kind of knowledge which slaves, for example, must have. There was a man in Syracuse, he tells, who had a school for slaves, where they learned the kind of things they had to do in the household. And it is also possible to say there is a kind of knowledge which the master needs in order to give commands to the slaves. But Aristotle says this is not something grand, this kind of knowledge, and he who can afford it will have a bailiff who takes care of this kind of knowledge. And the masters themselves will lead a political life or will seek for wisdom. Here you have this simple alternative. The truly human life is either political life or the life of quest for wisdom, philosophy in Greek. An alternative to which we shall have to come back more than once. Now, the next great theme, also belonging to the economics, is that part which has to do not with human beings, in particular slaves, but with other kinds of property. And here the greatest question is the relation of money making to management of the household. Aristotle asserts that they are two entirely different things. The distinction is based, the distinction between money making and management of the household is based on a distinction between the natural forms of property, of acquisition or possession, and those which are not natural. The natural ones are essentially limited by what a man and his family can reasonably use. The art of acquiring money is essentially unlimited, and therefore there is something wrong with it. That a finite being should seek for infinite money. And amongst the natural forms of acquisition, the most important is the agriculture. Agriculture has a much higher status, according to Aristotle, according to Plato, than commerce, industry, and especially, which is the lowest, lending on interest, which from Aristotle's point of view is altogether unjust or immoral. Now we do not have to go into the details of Aristotle's economic teaching, his teaching regarding the natural and the unnatural forms of acquisition, points which some of which have a direct importance. For example, I mention only one point. The distinction which Marx makes with particular clarity between use value and exchange value is literally taken from Aristotle. Marx makes, of course, a very different use for it, and naturally, because for Marx, the fundamental phenomenon in the sphere of economics is production, which is not so in Aristotle. For Aristotle, the fundamental thing is the purpose of use, or if you look at the other side, the gifts of nature, rather than that which exists by means of human production. Into this I cannot go. The main point, which is so striking here as elsewhere, is the orientation by what is natural and not natural. Without it, one cannot understand anything of Aristotle's teachings at any point. There is a natural way of earning a livelihood and an unnatural. And the criterion is, for example, whether it is determined, whether it has limits, or whether it is unlimited. What is natural is necessarily limited, has a specific character. Nature means primarily the nature of a particular kind of things, whether they are men or dogs or horses, i.e. things distinguished from others, separate from the others, having a limit with a view to others. The unlimited is, from this point of view, not natural. After having gone through the economic question, of which the issue of slavery is a primary and in a way the most important part, Aristotle turns in the second book to a new subject. We have learned in our way that the polis is natural and its parts are natural, that there is a natural slavery, there is a natural way of acquiring property, and now we turn to the polis. But in which sense? The book 2 begins as follows. Since we have the intention to contemplate regarding the political association, which is the best of all for those who can live to the highest degree as they would wish, we must consider also the other forms of government which some of the cities use, those cities which are reputed to be well administered, and if there should be any others which have been said, pronounced by some people, and which have the reputation of being good, so that we will see what is correct and useful in them and what is not, and so on. Now Aristotle turns then here to the question of the best form of government. I will leave it at this provisional translation of the Greek word politeia. But before he turns to this question, he looks at what we can learn from what others present us. A, cities which are reputed to be admirable. Second, blueprints of cities which are reputed to be Athens. You see, Aristotle proceeds in a strictly commonsensical way. He finds his bearings by reputation, assuming that reputation is never entirely unfounded, surely not in reasonably free societies, and therefore it is of some help. But the strange thing is, for us so strange, that he treats the commonwealth, or the political orders, which exist in fact, say in Sparta, in the same way, in the same way in which he treats, say, Plato's Republic. In other words, whether this is an actual or a blueprinted order does not make any difference for Aristotle. This is quite remarkable. The procedure is incidentally not historical. He begins the discussion of these various regimes with Plato's proposals in the Republic and the Laws, then takes up the proposals by some earlier thinkers, and only then he turns to the actual orders which have a good reputation, such as Sparta. Characteristically not Athens. Athens is among the people whom Aristotle addresses not reputed to be a good polity. Therefore, it is treated with silence. We will discuss this next time. Now, amongst the discussions of the second book, the criticism of Plato is, of course, most important, because Aristotle does here something which he did not do in book 1, namely show that the household is, the family, as we can also say, is necessary. He only showed that the polis is superior, is essentially different from and broader, more comprehensive than the family. But he did not consider the possibility that there might be a family less, a household less polis, which theoretically is possible. That's exactly what Plato does in the Republic. So in the criticism of Plato's Republic, he shows why the household and private property and private family are necessary. And this is one very important point which Aristotle makes in Book 2. And the other is his discussion of the earliest political philosopher, as we can call him, Hippodamos, which you will also find there. And I think it would be helpful if you could have read it next Wednesday. That will facilitate the discussion. Now we have a minute or so left. Is there any point? Yes?
By the nature of the business, by laws.
No, but say a man has, say, acquired $100,000. There is nothing in the nature of the case which would speak against, in the nature of the case, as far as the economic situation is concerned, of his making, if he can, $1 million, $1 billion, and so on and so on. But if you look at it from the point of view, if you do not absolutize money, if you look at the whole context, and the whole context is human use of the property by the property owner, then you arrive at limits. I mean, unless you can say, well, he instead of accumulating money, he will go in for ever more luxury. He will have 50 yachts and 20 country houses and 50, whatever you do. But Aristotle would say, Or no, if you look at it again concretely, from the point of view of use, of good use, of virtuous use, which would not be, which would exclude showing off, mere conspicuous consumption, as well as stinginess, of course, then you would see you cannot go beyond a certain point that is in itself limited. This is what it means. That you can accumulate as many houses or pieces of or land or diamonds in the same way in which you can accumulate dollar bills. Aristotle knew, although he didn't know of paper money, but he thinks simply that money has is a very great convenience, but it has the temptation in it to make us forget what it is for, that is only a convenience. And this is a good example of what the ancients meant by mere convention. A mere convention is a convenience, but a convenience which somehow pretends to be independent, which and therefore, as it were, runs away from us. This is what. Is this not a bit clear, Mr. Liebel?
Recall, the pre-political state was one of war. What was the pre-political state or way of life of men as Aristotle saw? And also, why was the pre-political state insufficient?
Well, have you ever lived in a village? Not Greenwich Village. Well, then you see there are certain things which you cannot easily get there. It's the chances that you would meet there someone with whom you can talk about the things which interest you are smaller than in a larger. Your natural needs, the needs of your mind, cannot be so easily fulfilled. And you must not forget, of course, that any village in this country, or for that matter in Europe, is a part of a larger whole, and therefore not, disregarding that entirely. Yes?
Well, that's the second point we went first, but in reply, what did you say in Aristotle's own terms, beginning of our present company, the many have no regard to the mind, but only force with
Yes, well, as Aristotle says in the first book of the Politics, if we want to find out what is natural, we must look at the healthy, and in this sense normal members of the species, and not at those who are in one way or the other corrupt or deficient. That there are people who are perfectly happy without any cultivation of their mind is undeniable, but there is something wrong with them.
What you're saying is
they are, we call them sometimes dumb, and other terms of this kind, which you doubtless know as well as I do. And we cannot take our bearings by them. We should not despise them, but we cannot take our bearings by them. And if their needs, if they can be satisfied in a very dull community, that doesn't mean that we should be satisfied with it.
So what you're saying is that students of political philosophy who live in two different villages, one is thought they merge their towns and make cities.
Yeah, no, but Aristotle would say if it is truly a village and not a part of a polis, then there will not be any students of philosophy.
Then where the city come from? Who knew to make a city?
That is it. How will it come about? Well, strictly speaking, there are two ways in understanding it. That there is a kind of need, say common defense. I mean, one of these crude needs which everyone can understand. And then some villages settled together, and out of this a polis comes into being, and then once the polis is there is at least a chance for the higher things to develop. As Aristotle puts it, the polis comes into being for the sake of life, i.e. of mere life, self-defense and so on. But it is for the sake of living well. Living well not in the sense of what a glutton understands by living well, but living nobly. Now, whether this presupposes, this settling together of the city presupposes men of the greatest stature, surpassing the greatest philosophers, the founders, that is a long question. Whether, say a man like Theseus, the mythical founder of Athens, that is a long question. According to the popular view, of course, he was a hero, and not merely a philosopher. Whether Aristotle would accept that is a long question.
It's mentioned civil defense. There's generally war going on politically for Aristotle.
I beg your pardon?
There was generally war going on in the world pre-politically, according to Aristotle. In the pre-political world, there is no...
Yeah, well, I suppose both. I mean, there are peaceable and non-peaceable people and also communities. Ça dépend. There will be war, there will also be peace. That would not be the point. But people can defend themselves better by settling together and living together. Good. Well, then